Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Welcome to this special edition of Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera. This week, global food prices are coming down, but many countries are still facing acute food insecurity, with fragile and conflict-affected states particularly at risk. Also this week, the conflict in Sudan sparks a humanitarian crisis, with thousands fleeing to Chad and other neighboring countries, adding to an already alarming food crisis there. And nothing to eat. The food crisis is worsening across Africa, with millions of people affected by food insecurity. But could agriculture's transformation be the answer? Food. We all need it. We can't live without it. And when it grows scarce, our shared future is threatened. Economic crises, epidemics, conflicts, and extreme weather events can wreak havoc on global food systems, in particular when many of those shocks come at the same time. 2022 was a year of unprecedented challenges for the global food system. So is this year going to be any better? Well, global food prices fell in March this year for the 12th consecutive month, down to 20.5% from their peak in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization says. The decline was helped mainly by an agreement to unblock Ukraine's grain exports. But the FAO, together with other international organizations, has warned that concern remains high for developing countries, which are still facing double-digit food inflation, aggravated by the depreciation of their local currencies against the US dollar and their mounting debt burden. And that's leading to rising food insecurity and undernourishment. Over 30% of food is lost or wasted each year globally. That's a striking statistic, given the large number of people going hungry around the world. Over a third of all food produced, estimated at 2.5 billion tons globally, is lost or wasted each year. 1/3 of this occurs at the food production stage. Boston Consulting Group estimates that this wasted food is worth $230 billion. Well, this year is yet another one of extreme jeopardy for those struggling to feed their families, with more than 900,000 people around the world fighting to survive in famine-like conditions. This is 10 times more than 5 years ago, and that's an alarmingly rapid increase. The scale of the current global hunger and malnutrition crisis is growing bigger and bigger, with 345 million people projected to be food insecure in 2023 alone. And that's more than double the number of 2020, a staggering rise of 200 million people compared to pre-COVID-19 pandemic levels. But why is the world hungrier than ever? The United Nations World Food Programme says that a deadly combination of factors lies behind it. Conflict. It is still the biggest driver of hunger, with 70% of the world's hungry living in areas afflicted by war and violence. Conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan are further proof of how conflict feeds hunger. The climate crisis is another one of the leading causes of the steep rise in global hunger. Climate shocks destroy lives, crops and livelihoods, and undermine people's ability to feed themselves. Global fertilizer prices have climbed even faster than food prices, threatening to turn food affordability into a food availability crisis, with the production of maize, rice, soybean and wheat all falling in 2022. International aid agencies' operating costs are also at an all-time high. The World Food Programme's monthly operating costs are $73 million, above their 2019 average, a staggering 44% rise. The extra now spent on operating costs would have previously fed 4 million people for a month. Joining us now from Rome is Marco Sanchez. Marco is an economist and deputy director of the Agri-Food Economics Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. Marco, good to have you with us. Globally, food prices have begun to fall from their peak of early 2022, and yet in some places, food prices remain stubbornly high. What's going on?
The problem is what is going on at the domestic level within the countries. And there are several explanations as to why countries are still seeing an increase in food prices. There is an asymmetry in price transmissions, which means that domestic prices will always divert from the world prices for a while, and always permanently, because there are policy distortions that increase domestic prices, and that explains somehow what is going on. And these policy distortions refer to border measures, trade policies, export restrictions, policies to support farmers or consumers, depending on who is suffering the most, etc. The other aspect is that many developing countries are experiencing exchange rate depreciation. The currencies have been depreciating, and that implies a major impact on the import bill. I mean, food is costing much more for those countries who are experiencing exchange rate appreciation. So domestically, the food prices they are facing are increasing. And at the same time, to finalize this point, there is still very, very, very strong demand for food. So the consumer, is seeing some sort of recovery in the pockets, and they want to demand more food. Right. And that demand for food increases prices domestically.
Right. But if people can't afford to eat, are you satisfied with the international community's response to this? I mean, in 2022, the crisis was barely averted. What happens when the next food shock comes along? How much impact is climate change going to have on people's food insecurity?
That's a big question, right? Now, let me before answering your question, stress one point here. Even before the pandemic, and even before the war in Ukraine, we were showing numbers that, for example, in 2020 only, about 3.1 billion people in the world were not affording to eat healthy. Now, the response, I'm myself, quite pleased with having seen the Global Crisis Response Group of the UN being formed. And this group is helping decision makers to mobilize, solutions and development strategies to face the intersectional crisis between food, energy, and finance. And at the same time, many organizations are acting with innovations on how we move around this crisis.
So what's your outlook for the rest of the year, Marco? I mean, are food prices in these areas where they remain stubbornly high going to start to come down, or will, because of the pressures that you talked about, are people still going to be unable to afford to eat this time next year?
Yeah, I mean, the problem of affordability will remain for a while, even if prices continue to decline, because there are structural issues that affect agri-food systems' delivery of lower costly, nutritious foods that make up healthy diets. However, in terms of how the price may evolve, our thinking is that, world food prices will continue stable and may actually decline somehow. Depending on, of course, the market fundamentals, the developments in very key markets like energy, for example, and obviously what happens to weather. When you see, for example, El Niño looming, then you start worrying about what could happen, how the different stakeholders in the agri-food system will react to these things. But we think that world food prices will remain quite stable, if not declining. What happens at the domestic level is the problem, because here we are no longer talking only about food economics, but we're talking about macroeconomics. We're talking about mounting debts. We're talking about pressures on balance of payments, and therefore what is going on with exchange rate depreciation in countries that are particularly net food importers, who are seeing their import bills going up. So, that is why agri-food systems today, embrace not only the food systems actors, but we really have to work with all the international institutions that also deal with these macroeconomic aspects in the countries that are going under this stress.
Marco, it's been really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
You are most welcome.
Besides droughts, floods and disease outbreaks, conflict is one of the main drivers of food insecurity in the world. The one unfolding in Sudan is no different. Hundreds of people have been killed while thousands of others have had to flee to neighbouring countries, and that's adding to an already rampant food insecurity crisis there. The fighting has exacerbated an already difficult humanitarian situation inside Sudan, with over 11 million people barely meeting the minimum food requirements. while the UN World Food Programme has warned that the conflict could disrupt food shipments for more than 400,000 displaced people in neighbouring countries, and any delay delivering food will make it hard to get long-term supplies in place in time for the 5-month rainy season that is due to begin next month. Well, the United Nations says that more than 100,000 people have fled Sudan since the fighting broke out on April 15th. Al Jazeera's Ahmed Idris reports now from Gungur, near the Chad-Sudan border, where thousands of refugees from the Darfur region have been arriving.
They keep coming any way they can. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says an average of 100 people are registered here every day. All of them from Darfur, fleeing attacks from ethnic militias. Suleiman Ibrahim Abdallah just arrived with his family at this informal camp of 4,000. Not minding that even residents of the capital aren't faring much better. All he cares about now is how and where his family finds food and shelter. Blind and helpless, Juma Kathir Suleiman arrived 5 days ago with his large family, hoping also to find food, shelter, and some peace. So far, he says, he's found none.
We have had no food and no clean water since we arrived here 5 days ago.
The elders at Gungur camp may be preoccupied with safety and welfare of the family. But for the young ones, any time is amusement time. From Tendalti to Gungur and other border communities, the mass migration to Chad is fueled by violence and threats of it from ethnic militias and rebel groups. While some refugees want to go back home as soon as security improves, some say they plan to make their move to Chad permanent. The United Nations warns that the unfolding crisis in Sudan can plunge the entire region into a deeper crisis, something Chad government says it's taking seriously. That is crucial for Chad, whose peace is also fragile. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Gungur, near the Chad-Sudan border.
Well, joining us now from Nairobi is Deepmala Mala. Deepmala is the Vice President of Humanitarian Affairs at CARE International. Good to have you with us, Deepmala. What's the current humanitarian situation in Chad right now for Sudanese refugees?
The humanitarian situation in Chad is very sadly deteriorating, and I must highlight, even before the current crisis, due to the fighting in Sudan that started on 15th of April, Chad has been a humanitarian crisis where around 7 million people have been in humanitarian need. Chad, unfortunately, is a very forgotten crisis, and right now, what has been happening over the last few days, hundreds and tens and thousands of people are crossing the border and just settling up in villages, putting up in the open. We've been talking to our team. Some of them are trying to make huts with millet shacks, and majority of them are women and children. Very horrific and painful stories. The number of people who've come into Chad is around 50,000 now, and it is estimated to grow to over 100,000 in the next few days.
And what about those who've been left behind in Sudan? Some 15 million people are reportedly lacking basic food requirements.
The humanitarian crisis in Sudan is on the brink. And sometimes I shudder to think that what is going to happen next. As you said, almost 16 million people have been in need. That is 1/3 of the entire country. And let's talk about the food which people have. 1 in every 4 Sudanese has been going to bed hungry. We are talking of 11 million people. And all this is before the 15th of April. So there has been massive gaps in food. Children have been severely, acutely malnourished. About 4 million children, which are under the age of 5, including pregnant and lactating women, have been acutely malnourished. So what has happened after this? The services, basic health services, water, sanitation, electricity, power, that has been in huge shortage. I fear that a large number of health facilities, the reported number is around 61%, but I fear that this number could be higher. Those health facilities are closed. which means that the wounded and the injured are not getting medical aid. Those who have been on treatment for malnutrition have not been getting continued treatment. So it is just aggravating and becoming worse. And let us not forget the psychological trauma the people are facing. And a lot of them are, majority of them are women and children. And I must say, every crisis is harder for women and children, and the instances of sexual and gender-based violence is concerningly on the rise.
The World Food Programme has warned that it's going to be unable to feed those who've made it to Chad unless it receives urgent funding. I mean, how much money is needed? What sort of sum of money are we talking about here?
We are talking about hundreds of millions. And if I be specific, according to the humanitarian response plan for Chad, the last one, the latest one, we are talking of $674 million. Now, it may sound like a big number, but we are talking about 4.5 million people who urgently need this help. Many of them are on the brink. And it is to save lives. I would say that it's not only the money which should come, but also it needs to come at an urgency with some flexibility. The other problem which we have to be really worrying about and addressing is that the rainy season is about to set in the next 4 to 6 weeks. That means what? That our ability as humanitarians to be able to reach those people can be hampered, which means we really need to act fast. So Chad, as I said before, is a forgotten crisis. Now it is receiving so many of the new refugees coming in, which are women and children largely, really needs urgent attention so that we are able to save lives, alleviate suffering.
And something like, 40% of people live below the poverty line already there in Chad. And this is without the refugee crisis.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what has happened on 15th April has made it worse for people, harder for people. And usually when situations like this happen, the basic services to whatever level they are further impeded. The costs usually go higher. And, in all this, food is a primary need, but the area where majority of the refugees are putting up, it's very dry. So water and sanitation are also critical needs. And then once the rainy season sets in and people are living in crowded settlements, then waterborne diseases like cholera also bring up other risks. And as you alluded, we are talking of a context where almost half of the country is living below poverty line. So I would say in this day and age, it is not excusable, not acceptable that people are hungry just because they cannot access food. Because globally, there's more than enough food produced to feed all the billions that live on this planet. But it is triggered by conflict and displacement, and which has been aggravated in the last couple of weeks.
Dimala, it's been really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Africa is feeling the brunt of what's known as the perfect storm of food, fuel and fertilizer crisis exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, plus soaring inflation, rising debt and extreme weather events like droughts and floods. Farmers in Africa will need as much as $65 billion in loans every year to produce enough food to curb imports and cushion their economies from external shocks. The continent imports over 100 million metric tons of cereals at an annual cost of $75 billion, according to the African Development Bank. These importation costs could climb to $150 billion by 2030. Well, to discuss all of that, we're joined now from Cape Town by Peter Jacobs. Peter's a research director in the Inclusive Economic Development Division at the Human Sciences Research Council. Good to have you with us, Peter. Of course, we've been saying on the programme that since last year, the Ukraine war has caused an acute food crisis globally, especially there in Africa. What is the situation right now in Africa?
The situation is really dire, and it's indeed as a result of the war situation, with a lot of countries dependent upon imports. But we have seen a number of other factors or circumstances contributing to the dire situation, especially in three key regions of the continent. It's East Africa, Central Africa, and the certain parts of West Africa, especially around the Sahel area, around Burkina Faso and those countries. So those are the areas where we've got extreme food shortages, extreme levels of hunger, and a number of factors contributing to this. Then we've seen a little bit of relief on food imports to some of the countries, especially countries such as Egypt and Ethiopia, that have been the key ports where they have benefited from the Black Sea Grain Initiative that was negotiated by the United Nations and has recently been extended. And so this has brought a little bit of relief in some of the areas of grain deliveries to those 3 or 4 different ports in Egypt, Djibouti, and Ethiopia. The extent of the grain relief to the rest of the continent, however, it's dependent very much on localized productive capacity, as well as other factors that may influence the ability of producers, both farmers, to produce food locally.
Those imports are costing Africa dearly, the amount of money that it's having to spend. There are those who say that Africa could and should be feeding itself. In most African farms, though, the amount of rice, maize, other staple crops harvested per acre or hectare are often less than half of what farmers elsewhere in the world are producing. Why those substandard harvest levels? What does African agriculture need to do to improve crop yield?
That's a very important question. I think that cuts straight to the heart of it, because dependency on aid, whether through the Black Sea Grain Initiative and a whole host of other ventures, especially aid recently coming in through the World Food Program and support from Japan and France, those have had very limited extent, improvements. It is really the emphasis should be on moving Africa's own productive capacity. The factors that have really hampered Africa's development in the agricultural sector in the last few years have really been the climate situation, as well as localized conflicts. So the regions that I've mentioned earlier, especially in East Africa and certain parts of the Sahel, it's really been driven by localized conflicts as well as extreme drought conditions. And in those areas, it has been very, very difficult to upscale production and productive capacity. And those are the regions of the continent where we've got very, very high levels of food insecurity and hunger. Now, how can you change that around? The Malabo Agreement of 2014, which is going to have its 10th anniversary in next year, is really about investing in agricultural R&D, improving the ability of countries to support the agricultural sectors. In some countries, you've had very, very good investments in, for instance, input support programs and input support programs for farmers. That's really, really critical. We're specifically referring to the Zambian input support programs in Tanzania. I think those ones have really helped to improve, to a limited extent, some of the productive capacity.
Okay.
Whether those input support programs will be sufficient in the long run, we'll have to wait and see.
Peter, if you were in charge, how would you fix things? How can Africa find a long-term solution to hunger and malnutrition?
I think the first and most important task to improve the productive capacity in Africa is to invest increasingly in organic fertilizers. If we can have a large-scale program in line with the Malabo Agreement on heavy investment in organic fertilizer programs, I think that will help with crop growing productive areas. However, in the pastoral regions of the Sahel, that is where we have pastoral farmers with livestock, and that is going to be a little bit more complicated because they've had the drought and lack of rainfall there in those regions. And so there we've got to have different kinds of interventions. But obviously, we also need to focus on a reduction in conflict across the continent. Why? Because this has put a lot of pressures on urban settlements where you've got displaced populations crowding in those regions, and that resulted in really extreme food insecurity conditions. So if we can have interventions that can address productive capacity, improve productive capacity, address climate change problems, and reduce conflict, I think that would be an agenda for us to begin to address agricultural development in Africa in the short term.
Peter, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Much appreciated.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can get in touch by tweeting me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. There, you'll find individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.